Hello, everybody. Welcome back. Today is September the 3rd, and today's video is about Venus stationing direct. That's right, we're coming to I don't know if it's correct to say the end of Venus retrograde, but it's kind of like the turning point of Venus retrograde, if you catch my drift, right? Um, and maybe I will explain this a little bit. That I had made a video previous saying that Venus would be retrograde all summer long, and now we find ourselves at the beginning of the month of September, and Venus is stationing direct, and throughout the whole time, um, Venus had been retrograde in the sign of Leo, and Leo is this domicile of the Sun, and when Venus is retrograde, what it entails is slowing down, changing directions, gradually passing the Sun, and then slowing down again and resuming direct motion, right? But in between, so there's something interesting about the actual process of Venus retrograde, because that whole process of crossing the path of the Sun is understood symbolically to be a kind of a death rebirth process, right? And but there's something I have learned as an astrologer about the whole combustion thing, which is that it's not as simple just to say that when a planet is close to the Sun, it's simply just getting weaker, and then it gets weaker, and then it has this moment of rebirth, and then it gradually gets stronger again. But that while it's going, there's this whole thing about the speed aspect, right? And that like in a moment like today, with Venus in a station, it's like Venus is now separated from the Sun to the point where it's not really under the beams of the Sun at all anymore. But however, it's in this process of turning, and the turning is very kind of slow and not much is happening. But at least, it's in a different position where Venus is stronger, in the sense where Venus is at a new point of the cycle and isn't going through this kind of deconstructive, getting torn down, getting, like this deterioration process, right? And, I'm kind of at the point where I'm making these kinds of videos, and sometimes when I make these videos, I think I may be using the videos as a kind of a means to express myself, or to sort of express certain emotions that I may not have avenues to express these emotions otherwise in my life, in the terms of not having somebody to talk to, or not having an appropriate outlet for them. And that I've been kind of at this point reflecting back on some of the stuff that's been going on, and my whole process of making videos and putting them online and making it public and stuff like that. Because if anything, I think, well, Leo, there's something very kind of like putting yourself in the spotlight, kind of, and it has to do with popularity. And there's something that's about like this Venus retrograde that seems to do with like common trends and stuff like that. And I have to admit that, when like, we have to ask ourselves, what is astrology for? Why are we doing astrology? Why am I doing astrology videos and stuff like that? And if anything, like, why is astrology helpful? And, it's the point of astrology isn't to take little things that are going on and make mountains out of molehills and freak out about things and stuff like that. If anything, like, there's a sort of principle of being, kind of stoically reserved in the face of what's going on, and then and because you can look at the astrology and you can understand the dynamic, that you can see, I could have seen this coming, and I, psychologically prepare for it and stuff like this. But during this retrograde, for me, if I go back to, I was actually struggling a lot with my astrology channel all throughout this retrograde, in terms of, just dealing with get the planet as a grabber that pulls you out and all this kind of stuff. Because in my own chart, Venus is fairly in a prominent position, and I would say that the planet Venus sort of has a strong influence on my life in terms of, what motivates me and stuff like that. In terms whether that's Venus as being something that represents creativity in art and music, or if Venus represents desire for something like desire for social connection or desire for romance, even all this kind of stuff, right? Like it's and then doing an astrology channel as somebody who is basically that's the one thing that I have struggled with over the years is at one point in time maybe I was part of a friend group or was feeling more social or something like that. But, I often bring up this stuff about like, my mental health history and stuff like that. But it was like, having this sort of crisis of just really not being connected to something or having a desire to connect or to be part of something or to have a creative, being a creative person. Like it's kind of like it, having this kind of leftover thing. Like, as a teenager, I kind of wanted to start a punk rock band, but all my, attempts at starting punk rock bands as a teenager were fairly pathetic and didn't go anywhere. And I would go out to shows and see other people's bands, do their thing and then break up, and then everybody and now so I'm in a 30-year-old and I'm not really I've inherited my dad's guitar collection and all this kind of stuff, and I'm really interested, and I'm still just like it's like, how do you relate to the world around you, even if it's not about singing songs or like actually making music. It's like I think we use people like celebrities like David Bowie or like like punk rock like the Clash or the Sex. It's like it gives you an idea of how you a way that you can relate to the world around you, and a way that you can see yourself and stuff like that, right? But there's this whole kind of thing about having a creative process, about putting yourself out there, about being in the public, versus what is hidden and all this kind of stuff. And I don't know. For me, it has been a kind of a crisis, not really a crisis, but a kind of a I've been struggling with it. What can I say? Because I don't know. In some way, I think that the whole idea of a Venus, the Venus retrograde, the rebirth of Venus. I think it's also good to have some perspective in the sense that this happens roughly every 2 years. I think it's like 18 months. Every 18 months, Venus goes retrograde and does one of these things. So it's not even like that uncommon of an occurrence. It's kind of like, it's more like, like, if as people, we have to sleep every night. You know what I mean? And like, that we have these kind of like rhythms or whatever that we have to like the planets have their own rhythms, the planets have their own synodic cycle, and it's not like a once in a lifetime thing. It actually happens fairly regularly. It's like breathing in and out. It's like recharging. It's kind of refreshing. It's like it's getting a new position from which to approach the situation. And I think like one of the things about it is that during this kind of process of death and rebirth and being burnt up by the rays of the sun, it's kind of like my meditation teacher has this line about the dross, right? Like burning off the dross, right? And there's this kind of thing about like, like attachment or something like that, or like being, I think, in the shamanic people talk about soul retrieval, right? And it's sort of like, is your soul present in the situation that you're faced with now, or is your soul left behind somewhere? Like, there's this, I mean, there's kind of, sometimes it's like, I've heard like this line about air traffic or like air travel, where you're like, you shoot yourself across the world to another location, but your soul is still left behind somewhere, or like hanging. Your soul is like hovering over the Pacific Ocean or something. It hasn't caught up with you yet, right? And in that kind of sense, that it's like, I think that with this kind of thing, with Venus represents our desires and all the, and our will to, creation and self-expression and stuff like this, that it's like our soul can be caught up in all these old things, stuff in the past, investments in old friendships, investments in old identifications with different situations. And there can either be a resistance to letting that stuff go, or else, like oftentimes, maybe there can be a kind of a sense of impatience. Like, I kind of wish I wasn't caught up in that stuff, and I wish I could just kind of start fresh or something like that, right? Um, for me, it's just kind of interesting to go through this particular Venus retrograde, because it kind of shows me, like, there's a lot of stuff about like, there's this whole thing that I was talking about. Like, I had a kind of a social blunder with another astrologer, and it didn't even have anything to do with astrology. It had more to do with some popular trends and stuff like that. And honestly, I probably would just have been better off just not talking on Facebook about those topics, right? Um, but there's this whole thing about like, um, like, if you take, I mean, you could take a Deleuzian kind of perspective on like the affiliations, right? That I notice, like, sometimes when the online drama and stuff like this breaks out, and you feel really bad that you had a social connection or something like that fall apart, right? And this is kind of like in the death rebirth kind of process. It's like the what's like kind of happening is that, in this kind of sense, I think it also goes with Leo. It's like, if somebody who's in a position of power, or somebody who's in a position of authority, and not even in the sense of like this person, holds a position like an elected official or something like that, but just, this idea of success and being in a kind of a field of, where people are either publicly recognized and accepted, or they're not. And this kind of thing about like affiliation, right? Of like, who's on my team, who's on my side. And obviously, and then if you have somebody who's powerful and successful on your team, on your side, then that like helping you out or something like that, then it can kind of help to raise you up. And that by having these kind of bonds of association, that you are seen to be part of this kind of successful thing going on, or whatever. Or else, but at the same time, you could, if those fall apart, it feels like you are ever the more farther away from that state of being successful or being accepted into, by the community, or whatever, right? So it's sort of like, it comes as a kind of a, and it's also this kind of problem too about the audience, in that, I think it's kind of interesting. One of the things that has been on my mind has been this idea of the data culture that we have, right? That is all driven by numbers. And the thing is that in a lot of cases, when it comes to like how many subscribers you have, how many likes you have, all we see is just one number, but we don't actually know the reason why any one person would like a video or not, or why anybody chooses to subscribe or not. And then we also didn't even know if these people are real people or if they're bots. And it'd be, I guess I could, if I did something like, if I did like a Zoom, if I recorded these videos in Zoom meetings in front of an audience, I would have like some idea of who my audience was. But I think this is one of the things that that is an issue maybe with Venus retrograde is, like, I was watching the latest astrology podcast and they were talking about the female rapper Doja Cat getting into this problem of alienating your audience, right, or not getting along with your audience, or you're trying to. And when I make these videos, I'm trying to kind of like imagine who might be watching them, and what my relationship is with the person who's watching the videos, and what I would say to that person or not. But I don't even know necessarily if that they're watching my videos or not. I don't really know who's watching my videos. And then so if like which I was kind of like, one of the things that I was dealing with going into this Venus retrograde was the sense that there's a lot of people that maybe from my past, or that I may have decided that I didn't want to be friends with them anymore, or I didn't want to hang out with them anymore. But regardless of that, they may still watch my videos and try to send me messages and have like opinions about my life and what I'm doing. And then it became this thing of like wanting to tell people off or something like that. And then making a video like that where I was like kind of expressing some stuff, and then getting upset that I lost some followers. But then what if the people I lost were the people that I specifically were trying to tell off, and now those people aren't following me, and that's actually what I wanted to happen, right? Like that, in some way things are just working out the way I wanted to, right? I don't know. There's this thing going on about this Venus retrograde where I have to, like, it's like, where are you invested with Venus and your desires and your sense of social identity and all this kind of stuff, or what you want or something like that. And I always run into these personal things of being, I had all this apprehension going into this Venus retrograde because of, well, first of all, there's this whole thing about like a desire for friends, and it doesn't even have to be about romance or something like that, having a girlfriend or a wife or something. This could just be straight up platonic friends, or straight up feeling like you're part of a community, or straight up part of some social thing going on. And that the thing about Venus is that Venus is as much about what you can't have what you desire, what you like, without that being contrasted by something that you don't like. And then at the same time, when it comes to each specific person and each specific relationship, that each person may have things that we see as positives, and things that we see as negatives and stuff like that. So it's not a black and white thing with any person. But like, nonetheless, this whole thing about Venus, one of the things that I remember too is like, what you desire, what you want, that even if relationships and friendships don't last forever, that sometimes when you meet somebody and you start a new thing, there can be this moment where you're really excited by that person, that you really want to talk to that person. And I remember having a girlfriend that I met, and just like this time where you're like on the phone and you just like rack up your phone bill, and you're like, oh my god, I have to pay $200 for my phone bill because I don't have a very good cell phone plan, and I just spent like 6 hours talking to this person on the phone. But it's like the sense that it's worth it, that you're like, I don't even care if I wasted a bunch of money, that I was excited, and and that kind of thing, right? And I think there's like that kind of quality kind of represents these moments of desire, of what we're looking for. But it's like you can't just fill the gap with something. Like, you'd be like, this is what I want, and then try to fill the gap with something that really just isn't that, right? In the sense that, like, if somebody is trying to talk to you for hours and hours and hours and hours, but you are really just not you genuinely are not having that experience where you're excited to talk to this person and you're excited about the interaction with this person, it's like you can't force the magic to happen if it's not there, right? And and yet, at the same time, we still may have these kind of desires, or like it represents a kind of ideal of what you're looking for or what you're after, in terms of, even that may just be a short-lived moment at the very beginning of meeting somebody, and then if you gave it time or whatever, at some point in time you may be bored of this person and it may not be so exciting or something like that, right? But the whole thing is that it's like you can't force it. And then there's something about the Venus retrograde process is like the deterioration of Venus while she's going through this kind of death rebirth, is that it's like, there may have been, I had this kind of desire to be part of something or to have friends, and there may be people from my past who may show up in one form or another. But it's like, it's this Venus retrograde to me felt like this kind of like the sense of inertia, right? But it's like, on one hand, like, I'll just straight up, like, there's one friend who did come to visit me that I hung out with in person, was a kind of person who lives in a different place and stuff like that. But over the years, at different points in time, he would show up in different circumstances and stuff like this. But you can kind of see that, like, maybe a few years ago he would have showed up, and that we would have gone out and done some stuff, and it could be the circumstance of this particular moment of time, or it could be when you factor in everything going on with COVID or something like this. But it was kind of like, it wasn't really anything to really get very excited about at all. But, not to say that it wasn't nice to see the person or whatever, but it wasn't like, it was this kind of like the idea of something gradually fading out and not being like you're not in it. It's something from the past or whatever, right? Like, it's like, I think it could be similar to, like, maybe there are a lot of people who are adults and they may visit with old friends of theirs, and it's like, you're not living the glory days that you used to. You're just you catch up a little bit, but you're not going out and doing fun stuff or whatever. And it's not to say you have to. It's maybe appropriate to this particular moment, to this particular time. But at the same time, it's kind of like, there's certain weird things about this Venus retrograde, because there's some people that I really didn't expect to reach out that did. But in reaching out in such a way that's like, I feel like people trying to like make themselves available, but in such a way that there's not really much appeal in it. I don't want to make this personal to say that I'm all stuck up and various people are just not interesting to me. But kind of like, this whole thing, what I was saying about like when you're really excited to talk to the person you just met and you talk for 6 hours on the phone, it's kind of like, it's like with the kind of technology that we have, if people wanted to talk and have a conversation, there's not really anything holding you back. If you wanted to, you could talk about stuff and all this. But like, if you have this kind of like awkward conversation with somebody, and then they're like, "Oh yeah, why don't you come and visit sometime?" And it's like, this is like, you know, when I think about like wanting to visit people, I think about like, like this time, the whole thing about being you rack up 6 hours on the cell phone because time is flying because you just you can't get enough of talking to this person and you really enjoy it. But when it's like some old friend that you're kind of uncomfortable about, and it's kind of like you don't really want to talk to them, but you like, and then they're like, well, yeah, come visit me, and then you're like, what, so I can be stuck at your house feeling uncomfortable? Like, if why don't you, it doesn't matter if I'm like, if we visit each other in person or not, in that sense. Like, if we want to have a conversation, or if you want to have interaction, we don't even need to like be in the same room now with this technology. We could just talk on the phone. But the point is kind of like, it's like, if there was this desire to be like having this like, wow, and really like, I can't stop talking because I'm really into it, then we would be doing that, right? But instead, like, I think that's what this Venus retrograde has kind of felt like, is like, instead of having this moment of like intensity of excitement of like of connecting to a person, it's kind of like a whole bunch of little moments of people who are from the past and are kind of touching bases, but there's no real like kind of like there's no real desire. Like, it's kind of like I could just let this go. I'm not really that attached to it at all. But I mean, I think in the greater scheme of what's going on, I can kind of understand that as a kind of a letting go process. But the thing is, it's kind of funny because it's not really letting go, because it's like, well, I mean, it could just be resolving, like things neutralize out, where it's like, instead of having a grudge, or like, why doesn't this person ever call me? Why do my friends never contact me, or something like that? You may get contacted, but it's kind of like this feeling of apathy, of like, well, like, there's nothing really, you like, do you really, is this really something I'm supposed to be excited about, or is this really something, um I think one of the things that's been coming up for me, is that making these kinds of videos, that it's like, if you think about identification, right? That like, and you could split it up with the idea of the elements or the tarot cards, right? That you could say that if people, when people are stuck in their minds, right, when they're thinking, they're identified with their thoughts, they're identified with an idea, that could be like identification at the level of air, right? If people are caught up in identification, as in caught up in identification with the relationship ego, like, this is the me that exists in relationship. This is the me that exists in relationship to a friendship. The me that relates in relationship to a group dynamic. This is the me that relates to, in terms of a certain scene or community or whatever, right? This is the me that relates to things in terms of emotional connection or attachment needs or something like that, right? And then there could be an identification, Earth would be the material identification. This is the identification I have as somebody who contributes things of material value. This is the me that goes grocery shopping, that cooks dinner. This is the me that tidies things up. This is the me that presents physical work or whatever, right? Or you could also, wands could also be a little bit like that, because wands could be, this is the me that identifies as a doer, this is the me that identifies as an actor, this is the me that identifies as somebody who has agency, that there are all these different levels of identification, and that the truth of each person is beyond, each of these is a fragmentary kind of identification that may or may not even be in communication with the rest of the whole, right? And that there may be too much identification on the level of, like talking about Venus, that there may be a lot of identification with Venus at the level of emotional attachment, bonding, having friends, having relationships, being connected to a community, and that whereas, if you look at Venus at these other different levels, Venus at the level of Earth may have to do with Venus as the sensual appreciation for things like perfumes and the actual physical plucking of strings to make music and stuff like that, or the physicality of pleasure, right? And then if you looked at Venus in terms of fire, it would be like Venus in terms of action. That love, or you could say that love is in terms of what you do. Love is not what you say; it's what you do, or whatever. Like, how does that love inspire you to act in the world, right? How does love inspire you to make a difference, right? And that, and then at the level of air, it may be more conceptual. It may be more to do with social agreements and stuff like that. Like in terms of creating laws and rules and mediations that are maybe a bit less heart-based, but more, laid out in that air kind of way, right? But this kind of thing of that, the problem basically, I think, is that having these different identifications, having more gravity on certain kinds of identifications, and then having, attachments and stuff like that of like, I want things to be this way and I don't want things to be that way, and then basically having these identifications take over and then run the show. And then to the extent that, if I make an astrology video, what you're seeing is some kind of identification, and especially if I'm in an emotional state and I'm acting out or something like that, it's like the identification with a particularly wounded part of me that doesn't have any other opportunity to express itself, that is seeing this as an opportunity to take over the whole show, basically, and in often a kind of an unflattering way. And so I'm kind of like, I kind of want to, but I don't know if I am kind of thinking that there could be a better way to do this, right? Where I could just try to keep all the stuff out of my astrology videos and try to give people a kind of if you're creating something that I want to be materially, financially viable in terms of a successful astrology channel, a successful astrology practice, that to sort of see that these parts of me are not sabotaging the whole affair, right? Because if I'm just acting like an idiot in these videos, making a mess out of my channel because there's some wounded sub-personality identification at any one of these levels taking over and making a mess of things, I mean, does that really doing anybody any good, right? Maybe not, right? And so I think that's, one thing that I kind of have in mind after going through this process, or at least at this point, right? But I mean, one of the things about it is that I find it kind of, the whole idea of social media, I find, is kind of weird, because it's like, what is the I mean, to be also fair, I don't use Instagram anymore, and I don't use TikTok, and I don't use. I've been kind of not being feeling very keen on Facebook, and I'm kind of, like, could be on the verge of just deleting. I mean, like, I was only really justifying Facebook for a while for like buying secondhand music gear because it doesn't seem to be really useful for anything else. Um, but or I don't know. I guess you could like the marketplace in general or whatever, right? Um, but so like social media, like Marshall McLuhan said, like the sender is sent, right? Like we're not consuming images, we're not consuming words. In some way, we're just directly consuming people, right? In a way, right? Which is kind of like disgusting in a way if you think about it, right? That we're just like we just go log on to these sites just to kind of get like a download of just people, of like there are people out there that follow. Like I just have this thing. I'm holding myself back from just either deleting my social media or just deleting a lot of people off social media because I just going through this thing where there's one part of me that has some urge to connect with people or says some urge to be part of something, and but if I have to relate, I feel like I have to relate to people online from that identification, because if I don't, I kind of just have this attitude like this is really like what is the point, like, or I don't know, social media, the internet and all this kind of stuff, there's not really much going on really, right? Like in terms of like, like at least there are some good podcasts to listen to where you get kind of fulfilled on a certain level or whatever, right? But in terms of like social media, it's like you're being fed this sort of thing that is like a substitute for like real human social connection, and it's not even showing you anything that you'd even want most of the time, or at least for me. Like there's not, like, I don't know. That's why. um, and this is like there's two. I feel like there's I have different sides to my personality. One of the sides of my personality is just feels kind of like just disinterested in the whole thing, right? Or I think going back to what I was saying about like that moment where you are really genuinely excited to talk to somebody, like you can't you don't fake it. It just happens naturally, right? And it's sort of like there's this kind of like idea that like the more people we accept as friends on social media, the more likely I might get some chance to have some sort of interaction where it's like the person that you really, you know another hour could go by on the phone and you lose track of time, and because you're so just lost in rapture with connecting with somebody. But it's sort of like with the more people who add you as friends, the more you just get the sense that that's not going to happen with any of these people, that these people are really not those people, and that you really don't have any interest in them, right? But the thing is, my whole thing is like I don't really talk about, like, I often, what you can only really engage with social media on the level of being accepting and liking and stuff like that, and it's a bit counterproductive to go online and tell everybody to F off or whatever, right? Because I mean, you may as well just not go online if that's what your attitude is, right? I don't know. This is sort of like a funny, rambly one, but maybe it's just indicative of the state of mind I'm in today. Like I'm definitely in a different state of mind doing this video than some of the other videos that I've done, and I don't know if this is good or not. This may be, who knows? Maybe this is the worst astrology video I've ever done. It could be terrible, but the last one wasn't very good either. Oh dear, it's not. But my idea is I'm just gonna keep going through it. So thanks for watching. I don't know if anybody got anything out of this, but thanks for supporting me anyways, and thanks for not all unfollowing me. Maybe I could just make the worst astrology videos possible until everybody unsubscribes, and then I can call it quits. Maybe that's what I'll do. Anyways, thank you very much. Okay.